Great, David. Pleasure to get to see you again.
It's great to see you always. When Lindbergh flew the Atlantic, you were 5. How did that affect you?
Well, I was too young to really know what was going on, but I did hear about it later from my parents, and so I got interested in aviation a little bit then. I started building models, you know, the routine from there, and you heard the rest of it, but I was motivated. One thing I learned about it all was that don't take no for an answer. If you really want to do something, set your mind to it. And I've advocated this to young people as far back as I can remember. Don't let anybody tell you you can't do it. You learn how to do it, figure out a way to do it, and you are the only one that can make it happen. And you can go through a lot of disappointments in your young life, but don't give up if that's what you really wish to do.
You met Orville Wright. I'm not sure anybody in this room except you met Orville Wright. Or maybe none of the other recipients of the award have met Wright. But you've also met all the other, and knew all the great aviators. Doolittle, Lindbergh, Cochrane, and on through, you know, the astronauts of these days. Great aviators. What sets great aviators apart from good aviators?
I think the desire to excel. A lot of people have asked me questions like that, David, and I'm kind of hard-pressed to respond other than to say that I never was trying to think of myself as wanting to be the best pilot or anything like that, and I never thought I was and still don't. But I'll tell you this, I got assignments that forced me to do things I didn't want to do. When I was aged to fly, I wanted to fly combat. And I didn't get to do combat as early as I wanted to. And I flew some missions in England in Spitfires before we got any airplanes there. But I was driving myself, and all through my learning curves, I was trying to convince myself that I could do better than I had done the last flight I made. And if I was disappointed about, as I mentioned in that little film on the roll, if I didn't like it, I had to keep doing it until I was challenging myself every flight to try and be as smooth as I could be, because abruptness was what made me airsick. And so I was trying to conquer it. And for those who will get a chance to see this film, if you haven't already seen it, you'll see me pouring iced tea while I'm upside down. Well, that's how smooth I wanted to convince myself I could fly. And I could take a whole airliner full of people, and they'd never know they were upside down. They wouldn't spill a drop of their drink or miss their mouth.
All right, you mentioned that you didn't get into combat as early. There you were in North Africa, and you're putting airplanes together and test flying, and finally get into combat. Near Palermo, you and Tom Watt are sitting alert. And you're called up that there are airplanes coming, Italian airplanes coming from Palermo. And I'm wondering if you thought, this is my chance to be an ace. And you got up there, and what happened?
Well, they launched me, and there were 2 of us, and I spotted them way out on the horizon, just a bunch of specks. And the British air traffic controller said there are 100+ aircraft heading for Palermo. And I thought, boy, I tell you, this is going to be a field day like no fighter pilot ever had before in his life.
2 against 100.
Yeah. Well, I was going to outsmart them. As soon as I spotted them, I told Tom, I said, well, we're going to be 5,000 feet above them, and they're heading right at us, and I'll start our turn so that we'll be right on their tail and right even with them, and drop down on them and pick them off one at a time across the back of the force of airplanes. And we'll go with what, just, and watch our rounds. And boy, I was just as nervous as you can imagine. And boy, I was lining up and looking at everything. And I thought, oh boy, I got it. And I said, I must have said it 3 times to Tom, don't forget your safety switch on your guns. Well, all of a sudden I was lined up and I thought, I'll get that one right there. I got it, he's a piece of cake. And they said, hold your fire. Italy has capitulated. That beautiful dream, I thought I'd...
100 Italian airplanes surrendered to Hoover and Watt. Well, you got shot down. Of course, you were in Stalag Luft 1 for 16 months. You tried to escape over and over again. You finally escaped and found a German airplane, a Focke-Wulf 190. So what happened? And how concerned were you about trying to fly a German-marked airplane into Allied airspace?
Well, first of all, I'd like to apologize for it to all of you. That was the dumbest thing any fighter pilot. The most stupid thing anybody could have ever done. And I realized how stupid I was by the time I got airborne and I was sitting there and I couldn't hardly see out because I didn't have a parachute, didn't have a seat or anything to raise my height up. Where normally you sit on a parachute and you put your head up above the lines of your canopy edge there. So I was just looking like this. And I couldn't start the engine, and we had been given a gun. After we got out, we were scrounging for food and didn't know where in the hell we were. We were up on the Baltic Sea, and we were on a peninsula, and we swam across the water with a makeshift raft, and came up. There were 3 of us that got out. There were no successful escapes the whole time I was there at Stalag Luft 1 up on the Baltic Sea. When I got there were about 1,100 people, between 11 and 1,200, I would guess. And by the time I left, there were over 10,000. And there were no successful escapes. A lot of us got out, but we paid for it. And I want you to realize that being a prisoner of war with the Germans was like being in a country club compared to any of the other conflicts that our soldiers and pilots have been in. Look at what happened in Vietnam, the torturous treatment that they received. And I've talked about that many times, and I won't bother you with all of that because you know those stories. But they were mistreated. They were tortured. We didn't get that. We were hungry all the time. And it's pretty sad to be that young of age and you're trapped and you can't get out and do what you want to do or think as you want to. But I had motivation by a colonel by the name of Spicer, and I had never met him. This is worth telling you about. This colonel one day, each day they'd count us twice a day, line you up, and the Germans were going all through the ranks, and they would count you until they made sure that everybody for every building was accounted for. And you had to work on an escape committee if you wanted to engineer your own project, like digging a tunnel or whatever system you wanted to use to try and escape. But you had to go through some high-level people, the ranking people in the camp that were part of this escape committee. And I had finally made the grade, and it was an exciting time period for me, but the most important thing that happened to me was Russ Spicer standing up and saying that we had 2 prisoners that brought in some late information that the war forces were moving forward so fast because Patton was going past his supply route for ammunition and food, and the Germans put him over 1,000 men in a Spencer and closed them off, and they came in, instead of making them prisoners of war, they lined them all up and killed 1,000 of our men. But 2 of the fellows were dead, and they pretended to be dead. They were wounded, and our forces came by 3 or 4 days later, and they were still alive, and that's how the story got back to England, and General Eisenhower then put out this edict that there'll be no more escape attempts. And but be sure you treat the Germans like they're your enemy. And so Russ Spicer stood up and said, this whole thing told the story to all of us, and the Germans sitting there, the commandant, and all of the guards and everything. And finally, he said, I won't use his language, but he said, remember they're your blooming enemy, and let's make it difficult for them to keep us here. Let's make it miserable for them, and let's do everything we can to irritate them and to keep them upset. Well, I was motivated already, and now I had a bad excuse for going to solitary or getting beat up, but on one occasion I got beat up so bad that I was dragged out unconscious by my heels, and a couple of prisoners that were in the cell next to me wrote a letter to the VA after the war was over. They'd never heard of me again after that, when I was dragged out by my heels, and he wanted to know if I had survived and if they knew that I had been alive at that time. And I've still got that from the government, but it was interesting. They did keep up with you. But that's what Spicer did. He motivated us to fight him. When the war was over, Russ was promoted, he ended up as a 3-star general and head of Air Training Command. And I was, by this time, a civilian, and he said, I want everyone that's going through flight training in our Air Force to hear from you. And he said, I'll go to each of those bases with you, but I want you to motivate them. And I just talked to them like I'd talk to anybody else. If you're in there to win, and fight and give it your best, and don't give up. And he motivated me, and I'm sure that I helped him motivate a lot more too.
And he motivated you to escape also, which you tried many times before. Yeah. But you got the Focke-Wulf off the ground and flew to Holland?
Yeah, and I couldn't land at airfields I saw because, and I had no maps, I had no nothing, anything. And I couldn't read the instruments on the airplane. But I did know something about the airplane. Gus Lundquist was a prisoner of war. He was a test pilot out of Wright Field and was sent to England to evaluate their captured German airplanes. And he had just flown 10 hours in the Focke-Wulf 190 when he asked the general to let him go on a combat mission, which he wasn't supposed to do because of his clearances at Wright Field testing out new stuff. And the Germans never really knew that he was had been a test pilot. And so he never told them, and they didn't know. And he got into prison camp, and I heard from somebody that he had been stationed at Wright Field. Well, that's where I wanted to go after the war. And my commanding officer had told me, he said, if ever I can do anything for you after the war, I'll do so. And I told him that's what I wanted. He found out I was alive, and that's how I got to Wright Field. But the end of that was that Gus had coached me on what the 190 cockpit was like. And I thought, oh boy, he sketched it in this sand where everything was. And I got in, and it was months later when I finally, I got to where I could get out. And got to this airfield, which was deserted.
Yeah, where'd you land? Where did you land?
Well, I couldn't land anywhere until I got to Holland. I had to see windmills because the Germans what they would do, they'd mine the airfields when they deserted them or retreated, and we lost a lot of our forces in Africa coming across there. We'd run them out, and as soon as they'd run out, they'd mine the field, and we'd come in there like we were going to take over. We did, but we lost airplanes on the entry to get the police captured back to our forces. But it was a motivational thing, and anyway, that's the story.
So you landed in Holland. How'd the landing go?
I got to Holland, and I was so low on fuel, and no airport, no airfields. I passed over a lot of good ones, but no windmills. And so I waited till I had to see windmills because I knew they were against the Germans. And I wasn't smart enough to think that here you are in this airplane, no parachute, some second lieutenant right out of flight training is going to kill you just like that. And I went up to a cloud ceiling so I could duck into it if I got attacked by our own fighter forces. But I never had to do that, never saw another airplane. And when I just headed in the direction, went to the North Sea and then down the North Sea until I saw windmills. And by then I was out of fuel almost, and I knew I was getting desperate. And I was over the Zuyder Zee, I found out later, and I found a flat field. It looked pretty good, and I landed in there. And I was hoping I could save the airplane and fly it on to England just for the fun of it. Well, it wasn't to be. I landed, and even though I hadn't flown in a long time, I made a good landing, and I looked out and I could see a ditch that I hadn't seen, and I thought, if I go into that ditch, the airplane's going to flip inverted, and I'll be pinned in it upside down, and if it catches fire, I'm burned up. And so I decided to ground loop it, which means I booted full rudder, made the airplane spin around and go sidewise, the gear wiped out. And I'm sitting there all by myself in this big field, a forest over here, and I thought, now what are you going to do, you dumbhead? So I sat there and breathed a sigh of relief and that I was okay. And then I got out of the airplane, and I remember that on the other side of the trees I'd seen a road. It didn't look like it was used very much. So I thought I'd go over to that road, maybe some truck or somebody, because I knew that Holland was now back on our side. We had our forces in there. And so I was heading for that road, and I was just searching, trying to see through the trees, and all of a sudden heard this rustling around me. I looked, and there were pitchforks coming at me from everywhere. And they were the Dutch. They hated the Germans, and they saw me land in this airplane with German markings on it, and so they obviously thought I was a kraut. And so I put my hands up like that, said, I'd already told myself how stupid I was. Now I found that I was really stupid. And they let me keep walking, and I kept walking. I got to the road. I kept doing this and walking and pointing, and they just followed me. And got to the road and was standing there. I thought, now what are you going to do? I was hoping that somebody would come by that I could communicate with, because they couldn't speak anything in English. I couldn't speak their language. And so finally this British truck came along, and I ran in the middle of this road and stopped him, and he came out, and I told him, I said, I'm an American. They think I'm a Kraut, and I just flew in here in a German airplane. He said, I say, old chap, hop in here.
So you get back.
I didn't tell anybody about this, and about a year went by, and I was in Reading, Pennsylvania for an NAA event that they had there every year, and the fellow that came out of the prison camp with me and was there when I stole the airplane, he held the gun on the German to get it started for me, and he started telling people around me, somebody said he was dead, he was a close friend of mine, and I said, well, bring him over here. And my narrator said, my God, how many thousands of people did you say were in that prison camp? Everywhere we go, somebody says they were in that prison camp with you. And so I said, did the fellow tell you his name? And he did. He said it was Jerry Ennis. Well, he was one of the fighter pilots for my outfit, and he's the guy that escaped with me and held the gun while I took off. He never wanted to fly again. And he had read in the newspaper that I was going to be there, so he came to the show. And so the narrator said, boy, why don't you let him tell that story? I bet the crowd would like to hear it. Well, they did.
Bob, let's jump ahead. 1947, you're at Wright Field, where you wanted to be, and Colonel Al Boyd, head of the flight test program, puts together the Bell XS-1 team. You and Yeager, Bob Cardenas, and Jack Ridley, the 4 Air Force guys, Jack Russell, and who am I leaving out here? Dick Frost.
Yes.
And Ed Swindell. So he parks 7 guys, all young, in the middle of the desert at Muroc, and a few months later you break the sound barrier. How likely that something like that could happen today?
Well, I'd like to really share this, which is an interesting part of the story. There was a fellow by the name of Bill Council was the colonel in charge of flight test, and they'd already had a selection process. For those of you who are not familiar with it, the speed of sound was called a barrier, and we felt that there was some sort of a wall of resistance. A lot of people thought that, rather, and I didn't, but because I knew otherwise. But what was happening was when we got past 500 miles an hour, and Mach 1, the letter numerical 1 is the speed of sound. And 8/10 was about the average speed that we could get any of our airplanes in a vertical dive. P-38s were less than that, P-40s and P-39s were less, 51, and the P-47, you could get up to 8/10 and even faster. And we had special devices we put on it to break the air show flow down, and it's called compressibility. It's where the air starts burbling between the connection of the wing or the tail or parts of the airplane to the fuselage. And Larry Bell came along with the idea, what goes faster than sound already? Why is it such a big deal? The 30-06 rifle bullet would go Mach 1. And so he said, why don't we just build a fuselage that looks exactly like a 30-06 rifle bullet? And that's exactly what they did, just built it up the size to hold the fuel and in the cockpit and so forth. And I was then in flight test, and we were using a P-47 with different devices on it to get this airflow smoothed out so that you could go faster than 8/10, and I got it up to, with this device, up to 8.3. But there were 2 P-47 pilots, test pilots in the organization. Each were killed. And so when they I was the third to take over on the project, and I said, you know, I'd looked at everything that they had been doing in research and talked with all the engineering people, and I said, I think the electric motor failed, and that's why he couldn't, the device that was going to break the airflow wasn't capable of giving the effect that the engineering had designed, and designers thought would change this airflow and smooth it out, and then you wouldn't have this shaking, because the shaking would be a flutter condition, and then things start coming off the airplane, like the aileron would go, the trim tab on the aileron would go, and then the aileron, and then when the aileron goes off, it takes part of the tail. And so I said, I bet that electric motor failed, and they couldn't get, the pilots couldn't get the forces to make this thing come up. And so I said, I would like to have a manual, and let's build a telescoping rod that goes down from right by the side of the quadrant, down back of the rudder pedal, and goes all the way down, and then you can ratchet it up and bring it all the way up, because the canopy was way up here, and it goes back like this. And so you could have the force to pull this way. And I had ratchets so that you go just a little bit at a time and milk it to get it up to the angle you wanted. And I had a chase plane, which was a P-80, and he could stay at 500 all around, and I was going 500 straight down. And the airplane, I couldn't pull it out. The control forces were just like in concrete, you couldn't move them. And this device was the only thing to get you out. Once you were up I was at 0.83 at the time, and the airplane started shaking, and I heard a loud explosion. And when that happened, I was unconscious. I didn't know what happened. And so I came to, and I looked around, I found out where I was, and I looked at the wings of the airplane. The P-47 had straight wings, and they were up like this. They had buckled. I had gone right through blackout to unconsciousness. The forces were so great on the pullout, and because of this device working. And so I looked around, and my chase pilot said, "You're in bad shape, Bob. Can you hear me?" And I said, yes, I can hear you now, but how bad does it look? And he said, well, I don't think you can land it. He said, you got all these things missing on the airplane, the aileron and part of the tail. And I said, how about the gear? I said, I can hardly hear you because of all the noise that's in the cockpit. And he said, I don't know about the landing gear. He said, it's down. It looks like it's down, but he said, I don't think you can trust it. The wings are going to fold on you, because they were bent way up. It's unbelievable. Wrinkled just like that. And I said, well, I'm going to try to land it anyway. And so I put it down and parked it, because it never flew again. But well, I ended up at the top of the pyramid, and there were 16 of us competing to be the first to fly the X-1. And finally, the colonel that I was working for at the time got transferred, and unfortunately was later killed. And the new colonel came in, and he was a maintenance officer, and he had met Chuck Yeager. And I had met Chuck and thought he was one of the finest pilots I'd ever seen in my life. And as a dogfighter, he could, boy, I tell you, you couldn't get on his tail, and he couldn't get on my tail. And we've talked about it over the years. We've gone against people. Both of us had a quick knowledge of energy management. And turns out that this Al Boyd took over as the new colonel, and he had been a maintenance officer, and he met Chuck and liked him, and one day he called me in, and I was all worried about who was going to get my slot, because I felt that I didn't really think that other people who were in the pyramid with me really had the stuff it took to go push it out the way you're going to, you don't know whether you're going to come back or not. And when I called me and he said, do you know a Captain Yeager? And I said, yes, sir, I do. And I didn't let him know I liked him and thought he was great. But I was just inside thinking, if he says Chuck is the guy, I knew he was good in the cockpit. I knew he had the courage, and he'd shot down a lot of airplanes. So you know he was skilled and not afraid of the enemy or what would happen to him as a test pilot. And I was elated then, but I didn't let the colonel know. And Chuck could not have done a better job than he did. A magnificent job in flying that airplane, and he did everything just right. And as far as I'm concerned, he's one of the great heroes of our time. And
well, Bob, that said, you were, of course, flying chase on him that day, and you took that famous photograph with the diamonds coming out the back of the Bell XS-1, and you took that photograph of him breaking the sound barrier. How disappointed have you been, or were you over the years, that you never actually got to fly that particular rocket plane?
Well, at the time before Chuck came on board, I was really disturbed because I thought I'd already put myself at harm's way, to get where I was in flight test, to have been on the other projects of compressibility. And I just thought, well, I deserve it maybe, because I've been hanging myself out in the breeze. And but when Chuck got it, that attitude went out the window. I decided I was going to help him. And of course, that's what Boyd found. I knew I had more engineering experience because I was studying everything all the time. I didn't have a formal education, but I took the equivalent test of 2 years of structural engineering, and that helped me. And that's how I got into the test pilot school. And but I never regretted that. I would like to have done it, of course. Everybody would like to be the first to do something. That was the biggest accomplishment we had at that time.
Right. Bob, what is the word freedom? When I say the word freedom to you, what comes to your mind?
Well, it's exactly what I thought when I was 18 years of age and joined the service. I felt patriotic. I felt the storm clouds were building up over Europe, and we were going to surely get in that conflict one way or another with our relationship with Great Britain. And I decided I want to be out in front. And our democracy is the greatest anybody will ever have, and I believed in all of the things that we do believe in about our freedom and well, everything our country stands for. I want to tell you one last thing. The most important thing we have going for us is what that American flag stands for. And I've preached this a lot of times, and a lot of people have gotten upset with me about it, but when I'm out at an air show back in years gone by, and young people wouldn't stand up when the national anthem was played or put their hand over their chest, I got irritated about that. And I'd be at events and I'd see kids sitting on their rear end, and I'd yell at them, "Get up on your feet." One day I did that at Oshkosh, and there was some youngsters down near the pit area where our airplanes were, and I couldn't believe it. These two teenagers, about 17 I guess, were lying on the ground and the national anthem was playing. Everybody was standing at attention. They're lying on the ground. And I yelled at them, "Get on your feet!" And I blasted them until they got up on their feet. And I said, "Stand at attention and put your hand over your heart." And they stood there and they looked around at me with a frown on their face like they were angry as they could possibly be. And then when it was over with, I went over to, got close up to him, and wanted to talk to him, and I gave him a lecture. And I just said, I was deprived of seeing that magnificent red, white, and blue flag. It stands for our freedom. It's everything we believe in our country. And you should respect the hundreds of thousands of people that have been lost because they believed in our freedom. And you have that freedom. You respect that because you've got to respect our country. And about that time, this giant man came up from the other side of the car. He was lying on the ground on the other side of his boys. I thought, oh boy. I thought I was in deep yoga. But the gentleman came over and he said, could I shake your hand? And he shook hands with me. He said, nobody ever told me the things you just told my boys. I said, well, it comes from my heart, and I was ready to give my life for that flag, for this freedom that we got. And I said, I'd like other people to appreciate it too. He said, well, I'm for you. I said, I went through my whole adult life here, and I never knew about that. That's amazing to me. And I hear interviews now on TV in New York, people that don't even know what our freedom stands for. It amazes me. But anyway, enough of my...
Bob Hoover.